No. No, don't have much of an intro. Don't have much of an intro at all. But maybe we can get the universe to flash into existence rapidly. So rapidly that billions of years will have passed and we'll have a fully formed world in front of us. Whoosh! And there, to flash a light, and we're live. We're live. We're live. We're live. All of existence is now in frame. If you can't see it, it doesn't exist. Yeah. Whatever. Anyway, we're live. And we're gone. Peekaboo, and we're gone. Yeah, whatever. Whatever. Prepare to get your freakiness card stamped, cause it's another live stream. It's another live stream. And what do I want to talk about this time? All right, let's see. What is there? Intellivision. Intellivision's doing something interesting. And I could have drugged my Intellivision out of the other room, but that would have taken effort, mostly because of how much stuff blocks my way to get into the room where the Intellivision is. There's probably a lot of dust built up since the last time I was in there, and there was a lot of dust in there the last time I was in there. Intellivision, Tommy Tallarico. Tommy Tallarico's involved with Intellivision. So, had any misgivings about anything to do with Intellivision? Let those misgivings go straight to hell, because Tommy Tallarico's involved, and that's not sarcasm. That's actually pretty cool. That's a positive thing. Yeah. How about the exact opposite of what's going on with Intellivision? Where Intellivision, apparently, whether it's a good idea or not, we can judge that as time goes on. Intellivision is coming back with a new console, which oddly enough isn't backwards compatible with old Intellivision cartridges, despite that's what you would think if you see the name Intellivision being revived. But despite that, it's actually appears to be brought back with a lot of love and respect for video games and the video game industry in general. So there's also the opposite of that. There's AtGames. There's interesting stuff going on with AtGames. Yeah, AtGames. Yeah. How bad is AtGames? Bad. Then there's short treks. I mean, the new short treks. Yeah, it's not fair to call the short treks shit treks, because shit trek Discovery is already shit treks. So I mean, it doesn't really specifically cover short treks. But okay. Anyway, there's shit treks. Ghost, but oh yeah, that's right. There was recently an interesting. Melissa McCarthy is still claiming the reason why Ghostbusters 2016 failed was sexism. Yeah, that's something worth rambling on about and screaming at how stupid the human species is. And maybe I could even comment on CRTV. Yeah, CRTV. I've noticed for quite a while now a lot of ads for CRTV. Yeah, and if you're thinking cathode ray television, I wish that would be cool. I mean, I like those old cathode ray televisions. I don't know if you. I think of it as contrast, but I think the proper term for it is fidelity. But the distinct image of how even stuff in the dark has like a contrast that's distinct to it on those old cathode ray tube televisions. And you start to get that now with some contemporary televisions. Contemporary televisions are finally catching up with that. But I remember when they first came out with HD televisions, and I'd go into the stores where they'd be displaying these big screen HD televisions, and walk up to the screen, I'd look at it and be like, I like how there's a lot of detail in that, but I don't like how as soon as I'm on an angle with it, the visuals suck. You have to be on a perfect angle with it, and then it's like anything that's dark is pretty much invisible. Like everything that's they like sucked. Early high definition televisions, and I even mean into the 20s, like long after they were, even after they were like the most common type of television. They sucked. They really sucked. They were horrible. But now they're better. They're better now. But but I don't know. But the cathode ray tube televisions, I love those things. They're what television really should be. But HD TVs are finally getting caught up to that. It's like what you gave up by switching from standard definition cathode ray tube to high definition LCD and LED. And well, LED I think has more potential. I haven't really seen as many, but the LCD ones especially, the plasma ones tended to burn out. I mean, going from a cathode ray tube to a LCD television, no matter how high definition, no matter how expensive, it almost always sucked. Until recently, they're coming up in the world. There's OLED, organic light emitting diode. I think that's. Then there's what's the other one? I forget all the terms for the new televisions. But no, I'm not purposefully rambling on about televisions. CRTV. The C stands for conservative. Yeah, so that's probably a bad sign of whatever I'm going to talk about. But no, I've noticed a lot of ads for CRTV on YouTube a lot, and I see like various, mostly jackasses. I'm not actually on the ads for it every now. Some of them actually say some stuff that's worth listening to. And I thought to myself, even I'd actually consider signing up for like the free whatever just to take a look at it and possibly review it and comment on it. Might be interesting, even though I'm not expecting to like it. Every now and then, some of those people that I see on the CRTV stuff, on those ads, say something, that's actually interesting. The Louder with Crowder guy looks like might be able to tolerate him for 15 minutes or so, and one of the women on there, I forget what she was criticizing. She wasn't saying Hillary Clinton, but it sounded like she was doing a fairly decent job of criticizing Hillary Clinton. I think that's what she was talking about anyway. It's hard to say because but ultimately I would not sign up for a free dosage of CRTV because there's a slight risk that once the free period is up, they might have, it might be hard to opt out of it like some stuff is, and I'm just not willing to pay pay for something that includes the jackass from Duck Dynasty. The jackass from Duck Dynasty's on there, and I'll what they have to say other places, but. No, not signing up for CRTV, even though it actually was kind of intriguing. They talk about being anti-censorship, which is kind of an illusion of the time. The conservative right has, well, the right wing is generally conservative. The right wing side of things has been pretending to be pro free speech when traditionally and technically still they're one of the most easily upset and agitated form of snowflake you'll ever see. And I say that about right wing in general, but actually the libertarian right, not so much them, but that's another issue. I'm just going to put this card away. Yeah. Alright, so what should I ramble on about first? Well, I already rambled on about CRTV quite a bit. But yeah, when I see those CRTV ads on YouTube videos, and I spend less and less time watching YouTube all the time, and pretty much every other website out there more that has video streaming. But what do I do when I see one of those CRTV ads on YouTube? What's a very important thing that I do when I see it? I watch it. Because I know that if that ad is running on a video, especially if it's a video for a content creator that I like, or even if I don't, I know they're paying to have that ad run. So if a CRTV ad comes up in front of a Secular Talk video, I'm perfectly. I want that ad revenue to go to Kyle Kalinske of Secular Talk. I think that's good work. I want to see him get paid, so I'll watch the ads on his videos. And if I see the CRTV ad, I'm damn well sure going to watch it so that he's gonna make some money off of it. If they'll actually run an ad on an Amazing Atheist video, yeah, I'm gonna watch that ad. You know, whenever I see the CRTV ad, I watch the damn thing. I listen to see if they actually say anything interesting. I listen to see if they say anything good or bad. And, you know, because it might be something worth commenting on in the future, or it might even be something worth thinking about. Because every now and then, those conservatives do say something halfway decent. So, and often it's accidentally halfway decent, but they sometimes say something worth listening to. So I listen to the ad, I watch it in full, I make sure that it at least gets 30 seconds of play, and and then I go on and watch whatever video I'm waiting for. Because if they wanna run an ad on a Jacqueline Glenn video or a Creationist Cat video or a Cult of Dusty video, great, They just paid that person money to have their ad run on their video. And I'm the one that watched it, sitting there thinking to myself, oh, what crap is this? Duck Dynasty jackass is involved with it, so it's a little too disgusting for me. But hey, go ahead. Spend money on my favorite YouTube content creators. I say go for it. Go for it. If it comes up and I watch a video where Rerez is interviewing Tommy Tallarico, I don't remember what ads came up when I watched that, but if it did, then good. That's what I want to see. That's what I want to see. Go ahead, advertise CRTV. I kind of like that. I kind of like seeing those ads, and I watch them. I don't necessarily like in the ads. They're actually not as bad as I would expect, like some of the stuff you'll see in those ads. But go ahead, Go ahead, CRTV. Keep advertising on YouTube. And I think it's just great when you support my favorite content creators accidentally, as you accidentally get me as a viewer who's probably never going to sign up for CRTV. Of course, you never know. I might actually check it out sometime. It's not very likely. Especially not as long as that Duck Dynasty jackass is still on there, but, whatever. Whatever. So what can I ramble on about? Recording this directly onto the internet, which actually is a far better encoding format than anything that I could end up saving this to my computer at. Alright, my notes here. Intellivision and Tommy Tallarico. Yeah, you see, when Intellivision, the name came back for the Intellivision Amico, there was enough stuff going on with video game consoles where I was a little more interested in the Commodore 64 Mini. Gotta get that. Come on. The Commodore 64 was bloody fucking awesome. The Commodore 64 Mini, the good news that Sega divorced At Games, whom Sega licensed their trademark out to, that was in the news. It's like, good, that means the Sega Genesis Mini is not going to be made by At Games. That was good news. Very good news. And I'm not saying At Games doesn't do anything that's good. They did some great stuff. They just really crapped over the Sega stuff they did. They really half-assed a whole bunch of stuff. They really half-assed everything they did related to Sega. So it was time for Sega to say, screw you, motherfuckers. We're getting our trademark the hell away from you. And that's kind of what they did. Like that was like, there was like all sorts of little things going on, like the name Intellivision popping up didn't really catch my attention. But there's a Kickstarter that I think is very interesting for the CollectorVision, oh damn it, I don't even remember what they call it, the CollectorVision something or other, which is a contemporary ColecoVision playing device, which seems like a great idea. Oddly enough, they added controller ports, so you can play the games with Super Nintendo controller ports, which just make me think, why? Why Super Nintendo? You can already plug Sega Genesis controllers into it, which is perfect. Far better for playing those types of games, or most games in general. But the thing that I want to see, and I'm not sure if they set it up so that you can do it this way, what I really want to see is so that you can play with Sega Genesis controllers or Atari controllers, but preferably Sega controllers, either Master System or Genesis, preferably Genesis. But even Sega Master System would be kind of better than most Atari controllers. But some sort of controller that's not the ColecoVision controller, to be able to play with those controllers, which you can already do on the original ColecoVision. Sort of. But to be able to play with those controllers without needing an actual ColecoVision controller plugged into the Player One port. Because most of those damn games required you to press a button on the keypad on the ColecoVision control pad. So the best you could do for decent controls on the ColecoVision was to take the Player One controller for the ColecoVision, press the button on it that corresponds with a two-player game, let Player One die, or just kind of suffer through using that little knobby little ColecoVision damn controller. And then with Player 2, play with a 3-button Sega Genesis controller or a Sega Master System controller, or if you could get like the Atari control pad that they released in Europe, or even an Atari joystick. I'm not a big fan of the Atari joystick, but it's way better than the ColecoVision knobby little joystick thing where you're like holding it and you're just kind of like, it's just awkward. So to me that's all you need is like to know for sure there's some way to punch in your options from the keypad and not need to use the damn ColecoVision controller in Player One. That's the most important thing. After that, the best thing you could do is make it compatible with a Sega Genesis 6-button controller. I'm trying to remember if I had trouble using my Sega Genesis 6-button controller with the ColecoVision for some reason. I don't remember, but for some reason I thought I did. I thought there was some sort of problem with that. But it might not have been that I was using a regular 6-button controller. It might have been I might have been using that what's the name of it? It was made by Hyperkin, which actually was a pretty cool controller. But I noticed it wasn't compatible with the Atari stuff for some reason. That's an oddity that I really should make a video discussing sometime. But yeah, I'm not sure. For some reason, I thought I had trouble getting the 6-button controller to work with the ColecoVision when it came to Sega controllers. But I could be wrong about that. But the 3-button Sega Genesis controller works great with the ColecoVision, especially if it's a 2-player game, so you can plug it into Player 2 and then use them keypad to start the game. You have to do that on Player 1's controller, Player 1 control pad. Yeah. So there, I just rambled on about a real cool device that's coming from CollectorVision, when here I am intending to talk about Intellivision. Oh well. Yeah, that's why it doesn't matter if anybody's viewing or not. It doesn't matter. The real concern is what is that snag? The real concern is whether or not I'm getting views from somebody that's so stupid and psychotic that they're almost supernatural, and they're out there somewhere. I think this thing is actually just kind of picking up something off to the west. But anyway, yeah. You know, sometimes the brainwaves of people that are psychotic are some of those psychotic idiots could be hard to detect, I suppose. If you had a device that could detect brainwaves of somebody so psychotic that they're almost supernatural, it might be kind of hard to detect their brainwaves because many of them are pretty much brain dead. All the more mysterious how they function. But yeah, so I'm getting sidetracked joking about idiots out there on the internet, somewhere in the world. Some of the less pleasant examples of this infestation on planet Earth that is known as humanity. Although, I'm pretty sure some of them aren't human. But that's beside the point. I'm no more going on about the monsters on the internet or the monsters in the neighborhood. It's time to talk about Intellivision. And what's interesting about the Intellivision is when I first heard about it, it was like so much else to be distracted by and kind of ignore it because I like the name Intellivision. It stands for intelligent. Mispronouncing my words. Intelligent television. Yes, intelligent television. So, okay, that's not a bad name, you know. You can kind of get where they came up with that. I mean, you know, plugs into your television, you know, and a competitor of it would be the ColecoVision, uh, which Coleco kind of sounds almost like a video game sound. It's like a name that you think you really expect to be video game related. And my nose is itchy. That's beside the point. But the name Coleco, it almost sounds like it should be something video game related. It actually stands for the Connecticut Leather Company. That's kind of a disappointing sounding name. Ugh, leather. Blah. But whatever. The Connecticut Leather Company. Yeah, because when I think of electronics and video games, I think of stuff made out of cowhide. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, it just happened to be a company that got involved with, you know, electronic toys, and then took that to the higher levels of electronic entertainment, such as, you know, video games, full-on video games. And, you know, ColecoVision, you know, my first video game console was a ColecoVision with the expansion module to play the Atari 2600 games, which actually is a pretty cool device. But Intellivision, kind of a competitor for that. I guess a little bit early. Yeah, 79 I think was the year Intellivision came out, and 82 for ColecoVision. So it's not quite as powerful as a ColecoVision, but the Intellivision was more powerful than the Atari 2600. They're kind of competitors. And in fact, you'll see old ads in comic books from the early 80s for Intellivision games. So you can tell it really got out there. Intellivision had its impact on the market. And a lot of people forget about things that came out before the Nintendo Entertainment System, but you know it was like the second seller next to the Atari 2600 at a time when those two video game consoles were pretty important to the industry. And you'll still see, if you go to like yard sales, flea markets, and old video game stores that have old games, if you see a big collection of Atari 2600 games for sale, you'll often see some Intellivision games off to the side. Intellivision and ColecoVision both got out there well enough that you can still find their games. Excuse me, it's a little harder to find Magnavox Odyssey 2 games, but they're actually kind of cool too. That's actually a game. If they had said that they were reviving the Magnavox Odyssey line and name, that would have got my attention because of Magnavox Odyssey's history with video games in general. And I thought the Magnavox Odyssey 2 was kind of interesting, just for its own unique take on the games that they had, that they're kind of in some ways different, but also inspired by or ripped off from the various other popular games of the time. But there was a certain amount of creativity involved with what Magnavox did to get a variety of games for their console. And there were very few third-party video games, like stuff like Demon Attack, if I said the title right. I mean, I have a copy of it in the other room over there, and you know, so I should remember the name of it. But yeah, Demon Attack. You know, a few games. Atlantis. It had a version of Atlantis. You know, I don't know if it was officially licensed by Magnavox, but it was made for it. You know, you can get the cartridge and all that. You know, it's out there. So those games from that time period, knockoffs of the Atari 2600 and ColecoVision get my attention a little bit more than the name Intellivision did. Which is not that I dislike the Intellivision. I think it's a cool little game system, and if you get a later model that you can exchange the controllers on, then there's a chance you might be able to play like Player One without using a burnt out controller. You know, most of them came with the controllers wired right to the system, which was a bad idea. And then Player One's controller's always a little bit fucked up, but whatever. You know, some of the later models, though, you could unplug and plug the controllers back in, which means you're less likely to be forced to use a burnt-out controller in the Player One spot. Which is just like the universal problem they all have, you know. Player 2 plays better than Player 1, you know, because Player 1's almost always burnt out, and these damn controllers are just wired to the system. But yeah, so that's an issue with the Intellivision. And although mine, it doesn't play imperfectly. It doesn't play. No, it plays imperfectly. But Player One on that one is somewhat usable some of the time. You know, that's a tradition for Intellivision. And I think, but what the downside to the later models of Intellivision, I think, were they were no longer compatible with a few of the games that were made for the earlier models. But I think that had to do with the fact that some of those earlier games weren't actually licensed by Mattel for the Intellivision. So I think that was a deliberate thing. So there's some games that are made for the Intellivision that might not work on the later model of Intellivision that you otherwise would want simply because you want to be able to unplug and plug controllers into the thing. And that's your way of handling the fact that there's a good chance the Player One controller is going to be burnt out if it's wired to the system because nobody was ever able to switch the controllers around, and that one got used all the time. So, Intellivision is kind of like a quirky old game system. I'm sure a lot of people who played it have a certain amount of love for it. In fact, if you listen to Tommy Tallarico talk about it, whom was kind of an important name to the video game industry, yeah, he has a lot of nostalgia for it. And I can kind of respect that. But along comes the Intellivision Amico. Amico, I think that's how it's pronounced. Which kind of reminds me of ami from French, which is that how you pronounce it? Ami, the love in French. I think I don't know. I flunked French. Not good at French, but ami reminds me of that in French, and then it reminds me of amigo in I believe Italian, and amigo, you know. But apparently it's straight up Italian, I think is how they worded it, which also would kind of indicate, that general area of the world. You know, with throughout Europe, you know, a lot of words are very similar through various languages. So you're kind of getting in the right direction. Apparently, it's Italian for friend. The Intellivision friend. Sounds really positive, happy, friendly, comfortable. The Intellivision Amico. So it was, I guess, the Italian word for friend, apparently. And, yeah. So it didn't really stand out to me too much. But, you know, I was like, when I first looked at it, first saw it, I like I said, preoccupied looking at other things. The first thing that's going to come to your mind is that going to play old Intellivision games? Apparently not. It doesn't have a cartridge slot. There's no plans for it to play the actual old Intellivision cartridges. Oh, excuse me. Okay. Well, what's up with that? I mean, you bring back the Intellivision name, people are going to think, well, you know, it's bringing back, you know, it's going to be like a retro console that plays old video game cartridges. Or they might think it's going to be a new mini console, which it's not a mini console, so that immediately blows this out of the water. But, you know, they might think it's a mini console that's going to come preloaded with Intellivision games, kind of like the Intellivision Flashback that AtGames did, which apparently was something AtGames did and got right. A to go, AtGames. You just don't know how to work with Sega. You're just like, well, we'll put the games on this little thing here and it won't play the sound right, but nobody cares. And then everybody gets pissed off at AtGames and, well, we're going to come up with a better version of that. And it's like, the sound still sucks. And I was like, well, well, people buy it. People are buying this shit. So we're going to promote it. It's like, here we go. Here's another Sega system for you. Great way to play old Sega games. Just hook it up to your television, this little thing, takes very little power to plug it into your TV and plug it into a USB port, and, then you're done with it. Well, actually, one thing they did is they didn't go over to that. They usually had AC adapters, and it's like, sound still sucks. Like, every time they came out with something, they really screwed up everything they did with Sega, which pissed off a lot of people because it's like they have the license from Sega to do this, and then they do a bad job, and you're like, well, emulation's kind of hard, especially for the Sega Genesis, it's exceptionally hard. But it never improves, and it's like they're just phoning it in and don't care. And then it's like they're selling more shit, and they're going to get your attention if you want Sega-related stuff. Then you buy it because you want Sega stuff, and then you're pissed off at it, But apparently, from what I heard, and I haven't tried it, AtGames did make a good knockoff of the Intellivision with their Intellivision flashback. So AtGames is known for doing good Atari flashbacks, Coleco flashbacks, and Intellivision flashbacks. But the Sega Genesis flashback and their Sega Genesis stuff in general, they screwed that stuff up. But anyway, I'm talking about Intellivision. So apparently there's already like an Intellivision flashback out there. I don't know how well it was mass produced because I've seen it online, but I don't have one myself, and I hardly ever see these things in stores anyway. So it's hard for me to really guess, but I don't know how easy it would be to come across one of those, but they're out there. So that's been done. But this thing apparently it's not going to be a mini console like the flashback, or for that matter the NES and SNES classics. It's not going to be something like that. It's a whole new game system, but no backwards compatibility. And when you see that name Intellivision, you think that they're going to work on, like they're somehow going to draw upon the nostalgia and desire to play old Intellivision games. Even if that's a console that's now old enough, and kind of like it wasn't as big as Atari, so at the same time it also wouldn't have the same level of fan base as the Atari stuff. So again, it's like, what was the purpose of bringing back that name if it wasn't going to be something that let people who were really into old games play Intellivision games? Well, apparently, it has to do with the fact that the Intellivision brand name, well, it was originally a Mattel product. It was the Mattel Intellivision. Like Mattel made like electronic football, and even before that, they had the Mattel Electronic Auto Race, which were both little handheld electronic games that were pretty good for their time. And during the first generation of video games, kind of were like a predecessor of what would later become things like the Nintendo Game Boy and Sega Game Gear, Atari Lynx, and Nintendo DS eventually, like the early handheld games. And then in the second generation of video games, they went on with a full-blown console, the Mattel Intellivision, Intelligent Television. It was an early Mattel product, and it was one of Mattel's biggest involvements in the video game industry. They actually had connections with Nintendo when it came to selling stuff in Canada here, because I've seen the Mattel logo on Nintendo stuff, even though they're two very separate companies. So, so right there, I mean, you'd think that it would have something to do with that because it's been a name that's been gone so long. It's like if Sega came back with a console and they called it like Sega Dreamcast Plus or Sega Dreamcast 2. People would kind of expect it would have like some connection to the previous Dreamcast or Sega Genesis 4. And think, oh, it's the fourth model of the Sega Genesis, because there were actually a lot of models of Sega Genesis. But if Sega just brought back a console, Sega does come off as more recent, even though it's actually been quite a while since Sega made a new console. So people might be a little bit more accepting of it just being a straight up new console if Sega did it. But with the name Intellivision, it's just been gone so long, and it was part of Mattel. You think, that's it for them. If the name comes back, it's just got to be some sort of retro console. Because what else is it going to be? Well, I had read something about this before, but the actual people who were involved with Intellivision at Mattel had bought the trademark away from Mattel, and it was owned by somebody else other than Mattel, which is why there was something like the Intel 3 or Intev, I forget, but it was almost like an abbreviated version of the name Intellivision, and I thought it had a 3 on it. Like there was some model of the Intellivision that came out later after Mattel's involvement with the Intellivision had been released. I remember reading about that. Then it seemed like it would be an interesting game console to own, to add to my collection, but I never got one. Never happened. But I remember seeing them and reading a little bit about them. When I say seeing them, I remember seeing them in pictures on the internet. I think it might have been even eBay where I saw some. So I knew that Intellivision didn't just die with Mattel's loss of interest in Intellivision. But it was gone for so long, like it was kind of like you wouldn't expect a new console to be the Intellivision anything. You know, the Sega Dreamcast 2, the Sega Genesis 4, yeah, sure. The Nintendo Switch 2 in the future, perhaps. Xbox 84, because why not call it some random number when the third console is number 1? Names like you kind of expect that, but a new Intellivision, the Intellivision Amico, it just kind of like grabs you as out of nowhere, just kind of wrong. But apparently, the people who owned the Intellivision name were involved with video games. They remained involved with video games, and they kind of took care of this intellectual property, if that's the it's a proper term for the game content. Took care of this brand name to a degree, even though you didn't see it anywhere. It wasn't. Its owner. As trademarks go, it wasn't just something a large corporation stuck in the closet somewhere, and they're stuck it away in their files of intellectual property they'll never use again, and just forgot about it. So it wasn't brushed under the rug. The people who were involved with the console from the start, working for Mattel, now not part of Mattel, were the people still behind the name. And somehow Tommy Tallarico was friends of the current president of, or what was previously the current president of Intellivision, and friends with a lot of the people there. And if you don't know who Tommy Tallarico is, this is why this is promising. This has been a long rambling rant about Intellivision, but this is where it's kind of like, what? They're bringing back the name now? It's going to compete with what video game systems now? PlayStation 4 and Xbox One S and Xbox One X and Nintendo Switch going to compete with that? What? Intellivision? But it's not a retro console with a cartridge slot to play the old games? What? And it's not a mini flashback style classic console thing? What? Like all these are like, just what? What are they thinking? But the name Tommy Tallarico is actually a hint that this is something positive. Something positive. From what I've seen him reference of his history and from what I've read about him, he's somehow got a job with, I forget which video game company at first. I think somebody saw him wearing a TurboGrafx 16 shirt, blah, blah, blah. Some sort of story like that I remember hearing. But he had some involvement in the video game industry fairly early on. And he's actually a lot older than he looks. I remember watching him on the Electronic Playground, because this is where I first saw Tommy Tallarico. is there was a show called The Electronic Playground made somewhere in Canada, but my channels that I had access to here in Nova Scotia, just I didn't get the show, not very often. I saw it a couple times, liked it, and it was later on before I actually saw it regularly. But Tommy Tallarico, I saw him on Electronic Playground. Him and Victor Lucas, they had a really great TV show discussing and talking about video games. And he apparently already had some involvement in the video game industry prior to that. And it was just a great show. And as far as I know, it's still out there. The last few times I had seen it, they were reviewing like mobile games and stuff like that for the cell phones and stuff like that, which actually I've been recently playing some of the Sega Heroes game. Did I mention I was thinking about discussing Sega Heroes when I was trying to think of... No, it's not on the list here. Alright, I was thinking about talking about the Sega Heroes game I recently tried, which is actually pretty cool. Anyway, on the cell phone. They were reviewing like a bunch of cell phone games and stuff like that, which actually is stuff that, makes money. That's some of the biggest selling games are the stuff that people buy on cell phones. Which is not really what I think of when I think of the video game industry, but that is a big part of it. Anyway, yeah, last I saw the Electronic Playground, they're reviewing a lot of that stuff, and I just kind of got bored. But hey, it was a great show, and probably still is if it meets your interest. But Tommy Tallarico was on that for quite some time, and I'm itchy. That's right, I'm scratching. All right, yeah. So he was a pretty good reviewer of video games. He had a lot of personality, and then when you see him now, it's like, wow, he managed to avoid aging, which is cool. Apparently he's 50 or in his 50s, and you look at him and it's like he still looks like he could be like in his mid-20s, So apparently whatever success he had, he never got into all the drugs, alcohol, and STDs that a lot of celebrities have, and then they wither away like the not sure, because some of the people that withered away the most, they still survived to be old, dried out rock stars. So yeah, but he never withered away. When I saw an interview with him just not that long ago, it's like, did he age? How young was he back then? But apparently he's either 50 or in his 50s. Because he was alive back in the 70s, and he was 10 when the Intellivision came out, and wow, didn't age. But he's immortal. He might just be. He better watch out. Somebody might be coming for his hit. He looks like he should be in one of the Highlander movies or TV shows, because he did not age. But that's a point that I rambled on about way too much. But I remember watching him on the Electronic Playground, and now I've seen interviews with him talking about Intellivision now that he's involved with Intellivision. In fact, I think he's the president of the company now. The previous president passed away, and he's involved, and that's an incredibly good sign. Like, he was one of the first people to do a television show discussing video games, which a lot of people would have been cynical about. He was one of the people involved with making music for various excellent video games with excellent music. You remember the music from Earthworm Jim? That was him. Probably wasn't him alone, but he did the music for motherfucking Earthworm Jim. And the only thing that's wrong with Earthworm Jim is the difficulty curve, which curves upward a little too early in the game and curves a little too high. But that was a fucking awesome game, especially on the Sega Genesis, but even the Super Nintendo game's pretty impressive. But, like, smoothly animated, beautiful graphics, incredibly silly and hilarious. And yes, the people who made the music, they knew how to put the sound chips and video game systems to good use. Especially the Sega Genesis sound chip. I mean, that was an impressive soundtrack. It's perhaps it's not the most kick-ass music ever, but it had to be music that fit Earthworm Jim, and god damn it, they did a hell of a job with that game all around, and that was him. That was him. He was one of the main people involved with the music for Earthworm Jim and other games. Apparently, some of the old Terminator games and stuff like that, which are actually pretty good for their time. Especially the music and so forth. Disney's Aladdin. The Aladdin game. I think he was involved with the Aladdin game that was on the Sega Genesis. The one that got the best reviews of the two. It was an entirely different game on the Super Nintendo. Both of which apparently were great games. But the version on the Sega Genesis, the people that made the version for the Sega Genesis, when they made that, they hit the ground running, and it did whatever they did with it. They knew what they were doing. It was like when you play that game, it's like you might not even have any interest in Disney cartoons and Disney movies. You might fucking hate Disney movies, But you play that game and you're like, none of that would matter. It's a fucking perfect game. Well, maybe not perfect, but it's pretty fucking close. That game turned out good. And I suppose not every game he was involved with turned out good. I think he was involved with some of the Sonic the Hedgehog games after the gameplay got crappy. But they generally had good music. But then again, shortly after the gameplay went crappy, the music got weak. I mean, gameplay kind of went downhill with Sonic around Sonic 2006, which had pretty cool visuals, actually. I liked the realism to it. And if you could suffer through the gameplay to pick up on the story, there's actually a really complex and thoughtful story in Sonic 2006 that a lot of people don't stop and think about and give it the credit it deserves. Because what they were doing was actually incredibly thoughtful, and there's concepts in it like some people found the time travel confusing, but you can kind of follow it. It's actually, not that hard to follow, especially after you played the game. And then you realize when each section of the game took place and what led to what else, and and so forth. I was just actually kind of impressed with the story in Sonic 2006 and pissed off at the gameplay, but yeah, that was a special game. But that had amazing music to it. I don't think it was that game that he was involved with, but Sonic Unleashed, when that one came out, the music was not bad but weak. And it's like Sonic Colors, which was a pretty boring game overall. Like the gameplay I found boring, but it was playable. That was after they had a lot of glitchy and screwed up games like Sonic 2006, and just the controls in Sonic Unleashed were just horribly planned out and designed. But Sonic Colors was playable but boring. It just was not remotely fun. And Sonic Generations, actually, for what they had in Sonic Generations, which by ripping off past Sonic games in a way that actually worked, still wasn't as fun as playing the other games, except for the part that was a section where they redid part of Sonic 2006. That section of that game was not nearly as horrifically glitchy as what you'd get in Sonic 2006, so at least that was an improvement. But yeah, I mean, he was involved, but he was only involved with that stuff on the music side of things. But thinking about the Sonic games, I think the time he got involved with the Sonic games was when the music got kind of boring, but there's that. But he's also the same person that, actually had a whole orchestra playing video game music. Like, actually set up place to have, like, live video game music being played. He was the person behind that whole movement, that whole big thing where they were playing video game music live. He was behind that. He got that started. And that was a hit. And of course, that was another thing, apparently, a lot of people, of course, these were people outside the video game industry and outside video game fans. A lot of people were like, well, you can't do that. Nobody's going to want to listen to that. Why? It's better than it's better than movie soundtrack music. I mean, that's going to be awesome. And that was something that sold out. Like, a lot of what he was involved with, that was things that he should be skeptical of, or people were skeptical of, was successful. Like, and he never came off as just some hack that was involved with the industry in a half-assed attempt to get rich. And when I actually saw him do an interview with the guys at Rerez, um, they have the YouTube channel Rerez. I think that's how you pronounce it. Whatever. He came off as though he. It didn't seem fake either. Like a lot of times, this sort of thing comes off fake. But the way he talked about it, he sounded like he actually had a legitimate love for this product that they're trying to create, and was like really excited and enthusiastic about it, which is kind of promising as well too. Of course, I'm sure the people that made the Ouya were really excited and positive about it, and that thing kind of flunked. I mean, there's lots of people that are really excited, enthusiastic about things, and it just kind of goes down the toilet anyway. But you got to give, if this is something that he's behind, you got to give it some credit that he's generally known what he was doing, and a lot of the stuff he was involved with was really successful. I mean, he was a very interesting host to Electronic Playground and Reviews on the Run, which were two great shows that were interconnected. Reviews on the Run was basically an extension of Electronic Playground. And Electronic Playground thrived and continued. And as far as I know, I don't think it's been canceled. I just don't see it on anymore when I flip through the channels, but I hadn't really been following it all that closely, especially when I found it again after having seen it in a while, and it was mostly like they were reviewing stuff like cell phone games, and I just kind of got bored. But he wasn't on the show anymore at that point, and yeah, that was a show that came out at a time when there were other shows. I remember Game Pro, the magazine. They had a TV show version of that, and I thought it was good. What did it last, like 2 seasons? I'd love to get that on DVD or even on VHS. You know, like I wouldn't mind watching that again just to see the old video game reviews. But I thought Game Pro was pretty good. Didn't last. Electronic Playground, it lasted. It stuck around. It kept going. Game Nation was a pretty cool show. If you've ever seen Game Nation, and I was around for like 2 seasons. They also talked about video games. It was in the mid 90s, later 90s. I forget now. My favorite joke on Game Nation was actually when they were making fun of the people that make a big deal out of video game addiction, like it's like this big threat, and they had like this so many steps program for getting over video game addiction, and then the last step was like substitute addiction, and then they had like somebody drinking booze and smoking, yeah, which I remember laughing really hard at that joke because it's like they're making fun of how people, idiots at the time made a big deal out of video game addiction, which would be on par with movie addiction. Oh, I'm addicted to going and seeing movies. It's a threat to society. That kind of bullshit. Except nobody ever really came out with this thing of people being addicted to movies, There's some people that want to sit down and watch sports all day. It's like there's no sports addiction. They don't. But video game addiction. The big deal that. Well, the big hype and absurd nonsense around video games where people would criticize them for all kinds of fearful, idiotic, paranoid reasons. Video game addiction was one of them. That was what stood out to me most about Game Nation. But Game Nation actually was a pretty decent show. Went away. Lasted 2 seasons. Electronic Playground? No, that thrived. Like Tommy Tallarico, maybe this is going to be the thing where his luck runs out, but he has a history of getting involved with things related to the video game industry and just being successful. And when I heard him talk about it and describe it, I'm actually kind of rooting for I at no point in time was thinking, I hope this thing fails. The thing that I was least interested in when I saw the Intellivision Amico was that there was no cartridge slot, leaving you to think it's not going to work with physical media at all. But apparently it is going to have an SD card slot, and they are going to release some games on SD card. So they are going to release physical media, and To be honest, what do I think of, well, they're just releasing it on SD card. Well, that's something that, I mean, you can just download something and stick it on an SD card. That sort of attitude, I'm sure some people could think, but it's like, I actually kind of like that idea. It's kind of where, if physical media is going to continue, it's kind of where it probably should go. I mean, now most computers and so forth read from discs. Um, when they came out with the CD, prior to that, video game systems usually release their games on cartridges. Even some old computers. You can find old Commodore 64 games that were released on cartridge instead of floppy disk. Cartridges, it worked. It worked. It was a form of physical media, and you plugged it right in. And as far as I can tell with the cartridge, even like some of the bigger data files, even back then, I think would read a lot faster than a floppy disk, because the disk has to spin around and it reads the little magnetic bits on it and so forth, and you know. And the thing that I always disliked about floppy disks, I mean, I kind of liked floppy disks, especially the harder floppy disks that were a little bit smaller but held more data, because they seemed a little bit more protected from bending and so forth, the harder plastic. But the thing that I liked about floppy disks was just the aesthetic of it. But for all intents and purposes, what I hated about them kind of outweighed it, is that it was really easy for data to get corrupted on those old floppy disks. I mean, floppy disks are fragile. Not fragile that, oops, I dropped it, it's destroyed, but fragile like, oh, I put it in the computer, loaded it up, and poof, the data got fucked, It's like, data can just get screwed up on floppy disks way too easily. So, of course, something that's almost invincible, as long as you don't scratch it, was the CD, which replaced the floppy disk. And while video game cartridges were able to hold more than a single floppy disk, you could put hundreds of video game cartridges, or at least the data that was on video game cartridges, on a CD when it first came out. And by today's standards, the storage of a CD isn't all that much. But when CDs came out, the storage that they had was like massive compared to what was on a cartridge. And what was great about them, well, I remember reading magazines and seeing TurboGrafx CD games and Sega CD games and thinking, I'd like to play those games. That you could tell that there was something polished about them that was an enhancement above what was available on cartridges. And a lot of people criticize those early video games for just being a lot of full motion video games, and you picked your characters to walk this way, or you press the button at the right time. I mostly ignored those. Those didn't really get my attention. But when I saw some of the TurboGrafx CD games, like for example, Exile, Wicked Phenomenon, I remember reading about that in magazines, and some of the early Sega CD role-playing games, stuff like that. I was like, this looks interesting. And the thing was, you could pile so much data on a CD, it blew cartridges away. The only thing was, back then, it had to be an add-on system, because most systems were dealing in cartridges anyway, so if you already got the Sega Genesis, you had to buy an add-on that was even more expensive than the Sega Genesis to play the Sega CD games. But I actually ended up getting a Sega CD because of how much I loved the Genesis and the games on it, and I wanted to be able to play Sonic the Hedgehog CD, and there were other games, and some of the role-playing games that got my attention on the Sega CD, like Lunar, like stuff like that got my attention, and I wanted to get a Sega CD, and I got one, and that'd be a long story in and of itself. But CD gaming, I immediately knew this was the future of video games, because it was awesome. And some people complained about load time. It wasn't really that bad. Well, some games, but not much. So when the next generation of game systems, like the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation, were CD based, it's yeah, for sure, that's obvious. That's a no-brainer that's the way this has to go. And then when you see how games turned out on the Nintendo 64 compared to Saturn and PlayStation games, it's you can tell why. You want a CD-based video game system. There's no way Squaresoft was going to make their games and do what they were doing on cartridges. Even as advanced as cartridges were for the Nintendo 64, no, nothing compared to what you could do with a CD back then. So, of course, that was the natural way the video game should go, to the CD. And, of course, you want to pack even more data on a disc. The next step up was DVD. See, CDs used an infrared wavelength of light to write the data onto the disc, or to read the data from the disc. But if you can use a smaller wavelength, a more tightly packed wave of energy, that isn't as big as an infrared wave, something like visible light, because infrared is longer wavelengths than visible light, longer than red. You squeeze that down to so it's no longer infrared but actually red. You can fit more data on the disc, and then you have DVD. That was the whole idea behind DVD, was to get enough data on the disc that you could put entire movies on a disc. With a CD, could you put a movie on the disc? Yeah, either at low quality or just a little bit at a time. Could be a big data file. But also, you also have to have it so the disc is spinning fast enough to read the data. Most games at this point in time, loading time wasn't as bad because they worked that out a bit. But, and of course with a DVD, as the disc spins, you're reading the data. It's going to be easier to read data quickly off of the DVD disc than a CD, or I should say, an amount of data in specifically as opposed to percentage of the disc. Like DVD was an all-round improvement over CD. You can fit so much more data on the disc. And then if you squeeze that wavelength, that red wavelength down past, orange, yellow, green, even past blue to get into the indigo and violet range, purple, which, oddly enough, is when you're dealing with Blu-ray now, which technically isn't a blue wavelength of light. It's actually a little bit shorter than that. We're like purple, but it's still called Blu-ray. I guess maybe it's indigo. I don't know exactly what wavelength it is, but it's somewhere around that area in the electromagnetic spectrum. So you get Blu-ray, and Blu-ray, you pack more data on a Blu-ray disc or an HD DVD, which are basically the same thing. They just use like a blue laser or a probably purple laser, really, tighter wavelength than blue, and even more data. And that's basically the way things went. But you ended up with loading time again because games were just being packed with more and more data. So loading time was going to become an even bigger issue. So now a lot of games from the game systems, you end up installing them on the console, kind of like with the computer, which isn't so bad. I mean, when the disc goes into the system, it's a form of copy protection. You have a disc that's capable, that had all this data on it. Therefore, you know that whoever is playing the game owns a copy of it or has access to a copy of it, because they just stuck the disc in the machine. But for the most part, most of it is loading off of the stuff that was loaded onto the console. So yeah, you've basically installed the game on your system. And as long as you don't delete your save files, if you start to run out of space, you technically could delete the game without deleting your save files, and then reinstall it again later when you're going to play the game later. So, it's not the worst thing to have to, install a game on your console from the disc. But, but there's all that sort of stuff that they did to get around the fact that now there's so much data in a game that it's going to take a long time to load, so you end up installing the game on your console. Well, while all this was happening, while discs got better and better and better, that same basic technology that allowed for old video game cartridges and video game cards to do what they did kept getting better and better as well. And not being limited to a wavelength of light and how much of it can shine and successfully reflect off of a tiny little bit of a disc. Things like SD cards and USB thumb drives, like that sort of technology kind of surpassed what you can do with a DVD disc. And on top of that, the load times are even faster. So personally, I recommend sticking with physical media as much as possible. Like, if physical media in consoles goes away, it's like, why even bother with a video game console? Of course, then again, I always hate installing stuff on my computer, which is why I hate one of the things I hate about putting games on my computer. But uh, that's a different issue, but similar. But yeah, I mean, if physical media is like the thing that I like about video game consoles is they held on to physical media more so than the computer video game industry did. So the future of video games, like physical media, it wouldn't be a problem to move over to some sort of SD card format. And the one thing that is more convenient about digital downloads is the fact that when it's downloaded into your device, it's there. You don't have to worry about losing the copy of your disc. Of course, how much of a worry that is to you could have more to do with your own personal competency than how much of an issue that should be in general. But simple fact is, to have a physical copy that you actually own that you can stick into any machine you want is definitely a positive thing. And that you don't have to worry about it still being available on the internet to be re-downloaded and stuff like that. It's just it's a good idea to have, physical media. So really, some variation of an SD card could easily, if the video game industry wanted this, could easily be the future of physical media. Now, I'm kind of skeptical that the video game industry will implement something like that. To a certain degree, the little cartridges for the Nintendo Switch could be considered to be that sort of thing. But that's kind of unique. But really, I mean, even movies. I don't know. I think it would be a great format if some sort of card could be released with movies on it, and you just stick that into the machine you want to play it, and then eject it when you're done. I personally like that idea a lot more than dealing with digital downloads or Netflix, where Netflix sometimes has it, sometimes Netflix takes it away. It's like physical, like none of this stuff is a true replacement for physical media. The digital download stuff, like none of it. And I actually like the thought of somehow implementing SD cards and things like that as a future format that could phase out with time. Blu-ray discs and things like that. And this system apparently is going to focus on digital downloads, but actually have some physical media available for it, and it's going to be in the form of SD cards. So that's kind of interesting. It's not completely without physical media, and I'll have to see how I feel about that when I actually get a chance to see how that's implemented. But it's going to be mostly special collectible games and things like that that are going to get the SD card release. But apparently with this, there's going to be a focus on family-friendly games, on games that are there's going to be like some 2D games. Like, this isn't going to be a graphics powerhouse. But the thing is, I remember the term being used, this is not going to be a game system for graphics whores. If you're a graphics whore, this isn't the console for you. And I thought to myself, well, that statement in and of itself could be misleading, because this system is going to be made around, like, one of the things this is going to be made to do is the ability to produce 2D games more easily than the other consoles have. And you don't need all that processing power, because this isn't going to be as powerful of a processing device as the Xbox One X or the PlayStation 4 Pro or anything like that, or even the Nintendo Switch, which isn't as powerful as its competitors. But even with a lack of power, 2D graphics, it should be no trouble for it to handle that, especially if it's designed around them. And the thing about 2D graphics can look beautiful. uh, people used to go on about how great the graphics were when things got 3D in the era of Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn, and also Nintendo 64. And I used to find that such an ironic statement. When you talk about good graphics, I think it should actually look nice. And the thing about 3D at that time is it did not look as good as 2D looked. With 2D, you could get a beautiful image that actually looked really nice and really detailed. And while some of the 3D stuff, usually thanks to the usage of color, did look really nice, it didn't look accurate. It didn't look realistic. It looked 3D because objects moved around and kind of like 3D, but it generally looked shitty compared to 2D. So, if 2D graphics are a type of graphic you like, then this system could have that going for it. And of course, all game consoles can pull off 2D pretty good now. But the statement was that it was going to be made around producing 2D graphics, which means people that are making two-dimensional games, their games, if it's easier to develop something, that generally helps the game be made with a certain amount of quality. For example, on paper, if you look at the stats of the Sega Saturn, the Sega Saturn was designed with 2D games in mind, but it had 3D capabilities, and its all-round statistics on paper make it a far more powerful system than the Sony PlayStation. But the PlayStation was optimized for 3D graphics, and they were all very much capable of pulling off 2D graphics anyway. And as a result, a lot of games looked better on the PlayStation than the Saturn, simply because it was easier to make games on the PlayStation and easier to access and use the power and abilities built into the PlayStation, as opposed to the more convoluted design of the Sega Saturn, where programmers had to work harder for it and ended up not pulling off as good a graphics on the Saturn often. So that's kind of like an interesting thought. Like, this could have its own special market of games. And to a degree, it appears as though the Intellivision Amico is going to be a cross between the Wii and cell phone gaming. They're focusing on the market of people who are interested in the same sort of casual gaming that takes place on a cell phone. Going for that audience of people who want to do that. Now, the problem with that is you get your cell phone with you, you pick it up, it's always there with you, you screw around with it at any time. It's something you always have with you. It's right there. It's easy to just pick up because you always have it with you. So this thing doesn't look like it's going to be something you're just going to be able to carry around with you. And in a way, that's kind of the problem with the success of the Wii. Was the Wii did what cell phoning gaming does, is it appeals to a group of people that were generally thought of as not gamers. People in retirement homes were buying the Wii just to play Wii bowling. How did it help Wii sales out? Well, got the console sold, but unless you decide to get the other Wii Sports game or Wii Fit, that was about it. That was really appealing to that same demographic that got this thing sold in, kindergartens and retirement homes and families who never even thought of picking up a controller and playing another game. It was unique. It became this gadget that people wanted in their homes to play Wii bowling, and some of those other Wii Sports games. But then the more serious, stereotypical video games, the more complex ones, the ones that you can plug in a GameCube controller into the Wii and play with that, a lot of those games didn't necessarily sell as well as they did on the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. That said, you actually ended up with a pretty strong video game market where your best option for your home was to have an Xbox 360 and a Wii, and the two systems complementing each other. And you probably could have bought, especially early on, that is, you could have bought the two of them together for about the same cost as getting a PlayStation 3. So you're probably better off with that. But yeah, I mean, the Wii was in this special position in the market where people who normally didn't play video games wanted to play the Wii because it was different and unique and had mass appeal. But it didn't form any sort of brand loyalty. And a lot of the people that played the Wii, they didn't stop playing video games, but they lost interest in the Wii. The fad was over. Time to put the pet rocks and Nintendo Wii in the closet and forget about it. Because now everybody has a cell phone, you know? You get the cell phone and you twiddle your fingers on the screen and play your little puzzle games and all that wonderful stuff, which I'm not necessarily mocking, because I like some of those games. But that's basically what those gamers did. The market of what was generally thought of as non-gamers who loved the Wii, many of them, just moved on to play puzzle games on their cell phone. Though, that said, the cell phone games are incredibly successful. The Wii was incredibly successful in its time. And yeah, so this device with its unique look and apparently the controller, which kind of mimics the look of the old Intellivision controller, which I personally would find concerning because it wasn't a controller that went over very well. But apparently the directional pad is going to be good. And I guess where there used to be a number key, I think that's going to be like a touch screen. So that could be interesting. Like, this could be an interesting gadget that happens to be a video game system. Like, it's going to be different. And if it's different in the same way the Wii was that causes it to catch on, that could be pretty good. And as I talk about it, I obviously ramble, so I probably wouldn't keep anybody's interest long enough to get to this point. But I might sound fairly cynical of it. And I think most people hear the description of it are going to be kind of cynical of it when you think of all the video game consoles that failed to catch on. And when you look at what Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony did, even in this most recent console generation, before Nintendo came out with the Switch, they tried the Wii U, which they did a bad job of marketing, and a lot of people thought it was just an add-on for the Wii, and they wanted to move on to a newer console, like, some people actually thought that. Like, a lot of people didn't know what the hell the Wii U was. Now, me, I liked the Wii, but it was mostly because of the backwards compatibility with the GameCube, and the fact that most games, or at least a lot of games, I could use the GameCube controller with, because I loved the GameCube. I also loved the original Xbox and the Dreamcast. Like, those were some of my favorite video game systems, along with the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. So, I mean, the ability to keep playing games using the GameCube controller, I'm all for that. The GameCube controller had a really lame D-pad, but other than that, it was a great controller. What I liked the Wii for was basically just an extension of what I liked the GameCube for. Now, anything that made the Wii unique from the GameCube almost detracted from it rather than added something to me. So in the end, I actually like the GameCube more than the Wii because of that. Even though the Wii will play GameCube games plus Super Smash Brothers, Brawl, which was a great game, but it's still just a game, But when the Wii U came out, that kind of won me over back again. Like, I really liked the Wii U. I liked how you could play the games on the screen on the controller, or you could the screen on the television. Some games would let the visuals be both spots. And I liked how it was implemented. That big controller was a little bit excessive, but manageable. And I actually started really loving the Wii U, even though it flunked. It failed. But I reluctantly bought one. I wanted one, but I just never got around to it. And I picked up a Sonic the Hedgehog game that came with like a a free bonus of that you could unlock a special feature involving the characters from Knights, I think it was. So I was like, well, I got to get that. But the game itself was physical, but the Knights feature was the digital download. And in order to access it, I had to play the game, log onto the game by a certain time. So I was like, well, I better get a Wii before it's too late. I mean, a Wii U before it's too late. And I got the system and actually started loving it. That said, it never caught on. Never caught on. Xbox, in that same generation, came out with the Xbox One, weirdly named, because it was the third Xbox console, making it very weirdly named. But the Xbox One came out, and they wanted to do a bunch of bullshit where you had to be online all the time. It demanded that you be online for games to work. It demanded that you be online for the console to continue to work. What kind of bullshit nonsense is that? You know? And other things. And it was clear that it was moving, even though it was still offering physical media, it was clear that the damn thing was moving more towards digital distribution and a requirement for digital connection. And to me, that's just obnoxiously pathetic. I don't want that. Screw that. Whenever possible, I have my video game consoles completely disconnected from the internet, except for when I have a reason to want them connected to the internet. Screw that shit, you know. But Xbox One, when it first came out, that was their focus. And their new focus was on doing things a little bit differently. They wanted it to come with Kinect, which was kind of their answer to some of the freaky features of the Wii, you know. And the Wii had been so successful, you know, even though it was in the process of being forgotten. It wasn't being forgotten, but it was being remembered for sales, and they were thinking, this will be the gimmick that makes our console special when they're thinking of the Kinect, which kind of just made the console more expensive. So to compensate for the expensiveness of the Kinect, they made the console a little bit cheaper and, they a little less powerful in the processing category. And they got their asses kicked. Not by Nintendo, because the Nintendo Wii U went for something a little bit special, a little bit different to differentiate it. That controller that actually really impressed me was the direction that the Nintendo Wii U went to. And again, they got their asses handed to them for it. Sony PlayStation came out with the PlayStation 4. Straightforward console, and it was a little bit more powerful than the competition. And they kicked everybody's ass because they straight up video game console, exactly what video game players wanted. Didn't force you to be connected to the internet. You just need your video game disc. You stick it in the console. Straightforward, exactly what people wanted, and people bought it. Lots of them. It sold massively. It gave people exactly what they wanted and didn't screw around with some novelty that nobody cared about. The novelty that sold the original Wii was no longer a factor. Most of the people who might have wanted to play Wii bowling, they moved on, and they're probably playing Candy Crush on something similar to this. And, and good for them. They wanted to play a game, they're playing a game, The Wii's time was over, and while the Wii was a gimmick and a fad that worked really well for its time, it wasn't what really made the video game industry function. What made the console successful was the same thing that sold the Atari 2600, sold the Nintendo Entertainment System, sold the Sega Genesis, sold the Sony PlayStation 1 and the PlayStation 2, and even the original Xbox and the Xbox 360 was a straightforward video game console that was really good at what it did, playing video games. And it's a great bonus if it can also play DVD or Blu-ray movies. A real good bonus, that or audio CDs, again. That actually was a big part of what sold the PlayStation 2 in Japan, was its DVD capabilities. In fact, that was something I was interested in. I was thinking, the Dreamcast looks kind of cool. I love Sega. But the PlayStation 2, you get that history of PlayStation. And I want DVD movies. I want movies on discs that I can play in a video game player instead of the VCR. I mean, that's just an awesome idea. That's what I want. I want the PlayStation 2. But, the new Sonic game, convinced, and rumors of an upcoming Phantasy Star game. I had to get the Dreamcast, and I loved it. And then I started playing DVD movies when I got the Xbox, and it's like the PlayStation 2. Of the systems from that era, Dreamcast, Xbox, GameCube, and PlayStation 2, the PlayStation 2, to me, felt the most generic and least interesting of them. But I thought I was going to love it the most at the start, and didn't. But I was really excited for a video game console that had built-in DVD movie capability. That interested me. But ultimately, what made the game special was just the console special was just having a good library of games. And in the case of PlayStation 4, compared to its competitors, that's what it was, a straight-up game-playing machine that game players wanted. And that's what sold it. So the question is, will the uniqueness of the Intellivision, because it's not really meant to compete with the Xbox One or the PlayStation 4 or the upcoming, if it ever comes out, PlayStation 5. I'm just curious. Oh, there's a crow in the yard. I heard a bump. Maybe there was a car came in. Nope. Wasn't a car door. Actually, it could be the neighbors. They're not that far away. Maybe some sort of creepy internet stalker. I doubt it. I'm just joking because of reactions on the internet. But there are creepy people out there. But I don't think there's any creepy people in the yard, luckily. Yeah. But who knows? How long has this gone on? Yeah. So basically, I rambled on my thoughts about video games for quite a long time there. Yeah. So, but anyway, yeah. So, one thing that interests me about the Intellivision Amico is it's the people behind it. One of them's Tommy Tallarico, and I actually get the impression that it's being produced by people who will have a love and interest in the history of Intellivision, the Intellivision name, video games in general, and they want to make a console that is interesting to those who are not your stereotypical game player. Which, in a way, I am no longer a stereotypical game player as much as I play a lot of games. I have absolutely no interest in any Call of Duty that ever came out. In fact, one of my favorite eras of video game. In fact, I'm going to mention my second favorite era. I might as well say my most favorite era of video games is actually the 16-bit era with the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo, and the Sega CD. Love that stuff. Just fucking love it. Just great. It's just perfect. Love that stuff, especially the Sega Genesis. Well, also the Sega CD and the Super Nintendo. That's all so fucking good. Just awesome. Phantasy Star 4, Chrono Trigger. Fucking love it. Fucking love it. Fucking love it. It's just great. But my second favorite generation of video games was the era where I almost liked it even more, but it didn't quite beat the 16-bit era. And it wasn't even the next era after or the next era before, but it was the era that included the Dreamcast, the original Xbox, and the GameCube. And a lot of those games that I loved on the Dreamcast got re-released on the Xbox or the GameCube. There were a lot of games made at that time that I loved that looked better on the Xbox and the GameCube than on the PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 2 was also out there then. And the PlayStation 2 was the biggest, most selling system of the time, and I had one. I had one fairly early on into that generation. I had the Dreamcast. I think I got the Dreamcast in 2000. Was it Christmas of 2000? I think I got the Dreamcast. And fell in love with it. Great game system. But 2002, I think it was summer of 2002, I got the Xbox. I had to get the Xbox. And then that next Christmas, I managed to get my family, you ask a family member, well, you're gonna get me something for Christmas. How about the GameCube? Because I was in my 20s, but you know what? I usually get a pretty good Christmas present, so I was like, what about the GameCube? And I got a GameCube for Christmas. I cashed in I normally get a pretty good present for Christmas. Why not make it a GameCube? And I got the GameCube, and I loved the GameCube. And there was like so many games that were on the Dreamcast that got re-released on the Xbox and the GameCube, and there were like similarities. I loved the Xbox, loved the GameCube, loved the Dreamcast, and all this time, like even before I got the Dreamcast, I was thinking that the PlayStation 2 would win my interest over. And there were a couple games on it I really wanted. And yeah, about a year after I got the Xbox, I finally got around to picking up the PlayStation 2. And one of the first games I really had to get was Xenosaga Episode 1. But for the most part, I started playing I was surprised by how much I loved the GameCube after the Nintendo 64 I was kind of like, whatever. Nintendo 64 is there, but what do I care about it? It's like, GameCube, I loved it. Nintendo 64 is like, whatever, But the GameCube won me over. The PlayStation 2, when I finally got one, I was kind of like, whatever. It's kind of cool. I mean, there's some games I want to play on it, and I played some games on it, but it was just kind of there. The interesting stuff was all on the Xbox or the GameCube, or earlier had already been on the Dreamcast. And then there was stuff that was on all various different systems, and usually the Xbox or GameCube version looked better. And early on, sometimes some stuff looked better on the Dreamcast, I found, than the PlayStation 2. But the stuff that was unique to the PlayStation 2 just felt generic to me. Yeah, I liked God of War, but I was kind of like, I could take it or leave it. I was like, a lot of stuff on the PlayStation 2 was like that to me. To me, with the PlayStation 2, as successful as it was useful to me because it had so many games. But it wasn't the special games of the time. In fact, to me, even though I loved the Xbox, Dreamcast, and GameCube as much as I did, the PlayStation 2 to me started that feeling of the video game industry becoming generic and not as interesting. And then with its follow-up, the PlayStation 3, which I think might actually be my favorite PlayStation, mainly because it has such perfect backwards compatibility with PlayStation 1, but it has like the virtual memory cards and all that stuff, and and it's like PlayStation 1 plus the ability to play PlayStation 3 games. Like, I really like the PlayStation 3 actually. But, again, after the PlayStation 2, the Xbox 360, and the PlayStation 3, a lot of the games just felt fairly generic. Now, I really liked the Xbox 360, not as much as the original Xbox, but I really liked the Xbox 360. And that era of games, everything just started to feel a little bit more generic. Like, it wasn't just that everything was a Call of Duty, it's just that everything else it all fit in that category. Some of them were just military bullshit, and some of them were kind of like action fantasy games, but they were kind of dreary and just became just general action movies you could play out yourself that just weren't that interesting and not that fun. And it's not that I didn't like that things had a darker, grittier feel to it. I like that. In fact, I like a mixture of dark and gritty mixed in with hopeful, positive, and cartoony. I like it when they mix the two. The game Shadow the Hedgehog, fucking love it. I love what they did with that. I love how dark, serious storyline with characters that you normally wouldn't expect and that sort of thing. That's what I want in video games. That kind of uniqueness, that mixture of weird world building. But then things get serious and it's like things actually kind of matter a bit. That's what I want about video games. It could do that when stuff like that could be done in video games. That was one of the things I loved about them. Video games and comics have that uniqueness. It could be like some sort of absurd, silly world, but if you add consequences and horrible things happening, it would get serious and dark and fascinating, And that's what I wanted. That's what I want in video games and comics, But for the most part, it just felt generic. Everything started to feel generic. Now, some games of that era stood out. On the Xbox 360, I'd recommend Bayonetta from that time period. On the Wii, I'd recommend Super Smash Brothers Brawl. I mean, the Subspace Emissary was a great quest in Super Smash Brothers Brawl. At first, I was disappointed that it took so long for Sonic the Hedgehog to get involved in the story. Then, when you see how he's used in Subspace Emissary, that's awesome. Sonic the Hedgehog saves the Nintendo universe, or Nintendo multiverse. Just kind of funny when you think about it. But I think the guy, I think it was actually somebody who worked for Squaresoft that was hired to write the script for that, or to write the plotted that out. And it just seems so perfect. It just seems so hilariously perfect. And when you think about it, who else could sucker punch and kick ass against Taboo, the enemy in Super Smash Brothers Brawl? None of the other characters could hold their own against Taboo, or at least knock him off balance and, come in fast enough. And, it had to be Sonic the Hedgehog. As video game character, Sonic the Hedgehog is the Captain Kirk of video game characters, in that he's a killer of gods. It's not what he wants to do. He doesn't want to hurt other beings. But you know what? Gods are usually too much trouble. So, sometimes you gotta kill him, and that's what Sonic the Hedgehog is. He's a breaker of military hardware, and he's a killer of gods. What a lovely character Sonic the Hedgehog is. It's just one of the things that makes him so perfect. But yeah, I mean, that was awesome. Super Smash Brothers Brawl, Bayonetta on the Xbox 360. It's known for not being as good on the PlayStation 3, so I'll just say Xbox 360. And Ghostbusters. That one doesn't matter if it's Xbox 360 or PlayStation 3, but you want one of those versions over the Wii and PlayStation 2 versions of the game. Though those are also good games too, just not as great as the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 game. So, I mean, there's great stuff from that era, but for the most part, just picking up a random game from the era of Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Nintendo Wii, things started to feel more generic. Even the more cheerful, colorful stuff from Nintendo, still, it just feels like either another Nintendo game or another kind of like bright, colorful, light, fluffy, and vapid cartoony game that ended up on the Nintendo console because I thought it was a good place to publish a game like that. It's like that era just felt generic to me. And video games in general, just more and more come off as more of a generic thing. It's hard for me to get interested in the current trends in video games. Oh, there's a new Final Fantasy. Yeah, I don't care. Oh, Fortnite is amazing. Yeah, I don't care. Oh, there's a Call of Duty did something or other. It's like, I don't care. So, in a way, if done right, maybe the Intellivision Amico could be something that'll get my interest. And it's clear that the people behind it seem to have love for the project, especially if Tommy Tallarico was involved with it. So all of that is very positive, very happy thoughts about this device that's going to be released. So everything I could possibly ramble on about the Intellivision Amica, I'm not even saying words right. I'm getting low on caffeine here. Out of Energy drink, which has, that's a video game character. Pretty sure that's a game character. Forsaken 2 or something like that. Or is it Destiny 2 Forsaken? I don't know, and I don't care anymore. But, video game character on my energy drink. Alright, Out of Energy drink, time to switch over to Diet Dr. Pepper. But if I were to ramble on and on about the Intellivision Amico, ultimately, the people behind it, you can tell that they have a love for video games and the video game industry and the device that they're creating. Whether or not it'll win over me or you or anybody else involved with video games, it's hard to say. That one's not established. That's not known. That's an unknown factor, whether it's going to be successful or not. But you got to respect that they have a love for the video game industry. There's everything about their history and the people involved with it, including Tommy Tallarico, that says that this is a product that has love and respect and thoughtfulness behind it. So it's the exact opposite of anything at all I could possibly say at this time about AtGames. AtGames. They'll promote something you want it. They'll promote something like a classic game system full of Sega Genesis games, then you go and play it, and the audio sucks. And then they'll release another one that's supposed to be better, and it's just as bad. They don't care. They'll come up with something that's actually improved. When they came out with the Sega Genesis HD device, you know what? Some of the sound in that was good. Some of it was crap. Some of it was good. Some of it played kind of okay. Some of it played okay. And it was actually a pretty interesting device. I'll give them credit for that. It had its pros, it had its cons, and if you go into it knowing that it's not going to play the games perfectly, but most of them it will play, if you go into it knowing that, and the way you plug any controller into it, any Genesis controller that is, you plug any cartridge into it, you could create save states, all the stuff you could do with it. It's kind of like, it's not a worthless device, the last one, the best one they did based on Sega Genesis, but for all the good or bad involved with it, it was another flawed product that wasn't as good as what they advertised. And while they may have pulled off good versions of the Intellivision and ColecoVision in the past for their retro consoles, and actually did some pretty good stuff with Atari, I'll give them credit for that. Some of the Atari flashback consoles they worked on, pretty good, especially the little portable one. Oh, now my nose is itchy. But they have a history of not producing very good content, seeming to try and look like they're producing something that, as long as it's good enough to get you to buy it, they're going to make it, they're going to sell it, and you should just accept it. Their history of just doing a bad job with Sega Genesis hardware recreation, their history with that looks bad, looks very bad, especially how it went on for a long time. The first knockoff Sega Genesis, licensed knockoff of the Sega Genesis I had purchased, it was perfectly licensed, was one by Radica. Radica had a couple Sega Genesis clones. They weren't really clones. They were more like mutant clones, whatever. They're more like mutant Sega Genesises. They didn't get the sound right at all, but they weren't horribly expensive. They were just battery-operated video game controllers that had a little device that you put the batteries in that they were connected to, and then you plugged that into your television. And it was a simple, crude device. And at the time, and I'm talking like this was something like the year 2001, maybe 2002. At the time that I saw them, actually it was probably 2000. No, it was probably 2001. At the time that I saw them and they were out, with technology being as limited as it was at the time, and knowing how hard it was to emulate the Sega Genesis, it was disappointing that the sound was so bad, but you could kind of accept it for the novelty that it was. And then later, when AtGames came out with something similar, was a bit bigger, but, it was something similar. The AtGames Sega Genesis and the Blaze Sega Mega Drive, stuff like that. That was a pretty cool novelty when it first came out, but again, it was disappointing that the sound was so screwed up in that. And it was about as bad as the Radica version, but it was years later. And the fact that the AtGames Sega Genesis never improved at all until they came out with the HD version, and even that was pretty screwed up. Just came off like too little, too late, and they never really cared. Which is why so many people were glad that Sega decided to stop partnering with AtGames. In fact, people were horrified when they learned Sega is going to make awesome, it's going to be awesome, Sega's going to make a Sega Genesis. Oh, they're licensing it out to AtGames? No. don't waste your classic console on ad games. And then they didn't. They fired at games ass. You know, they or at least they took them off that project. You know, they moved away from at games. Good move, Sega. Took you all to figure that one out. They just been fucking you over for a couple decades. You know, whatever. So, at games quality for Sega Genesis was bad, and you could forgive them considering that the Sega Genesis is hard to emulate, but as bad as it was, and with so little improvement over so long of a time period, it came off as they had the license of something that had been incredibly popular in its time, and they got the license, and they were just going to make money off of it, and they seemed to have no concern for the quality of what they were making. You know, as long as they were selling shit, they were going to keep flinging shit as long as it stuck to the wall. And in this case, sticking to the wall basically just means it made enough money that, well, that they're making a profit at it. And that's how it came off. It came off like they didn't care about quality at all. And you know what? If they had improved their quality, yeah, I think they would have made more profit. But they were making profit and decided just good enough. And I don't know how much of this was, maybe they just couldn't do better and they're just trying to cover their asses by glazing over their glaring flaws. Or maybe they just didn't give a shit and they just wanted to keep doing what they were doing as lazily as possible, putting as little resources as possible into any form of development or improvement, and just keep going with it. Because although they did a good job with Atari, and they had some really great little portable systems, both for Atari and Sega Genesis. But once again, the Sega Genesis audio was screwed up. In fact, I have one of those devices, and if I had it in my hands right now, if it wasn't in another room that I'd have to run off and get, I'd pick it up, I'd look at it, and I'd be like, oh, this is so perfect to hold in the hands. The D-pad, the buttons are so awesome for such a tiny little controller. You switch it on, the screen looks so good. But then when it comes to actual quality, when you load up the game, it plays fine, looks fine on the screen, but the audio sucks so horribly. In fact, it's so bad, it's kind of like, you kind of want to hear a little bit of audio, you want some sort of reference to what's going on. You know, like when something strikes something else, you want to hear that thump, you want something to be coming from the speakers, you just want it, but you end up turning it down because you don't want to be experiencing it any more than you have to, so you turn it down so you can just barely hear it, because the audio is so horrible. And the fact that they're so close to making something so awesome, and then fuck up such an important detail, it's disappointing. And the thing is, if it was a hardware limitation, and future generations of the product would improve, you'd be kind of like, ooh, I'll get this now, but then when they come out with this version or that version in the future, I'm going to be so glad because that's going to be so awesome. But they don't seem to care. They know that they got something good enough to, entice people to buy it, but there's no sign that they care about the product whatsoever. And it's so close to being good, you just want to love it. But then they fucked up something that bad, you just kind of half the time you end up hating it. That's what At Games does. They do good enough to make money, but here's how bad they are now. Here's how bad it is, and here's why. If you're cynical and you think they just don't give a shit, so they're just doing shit quality because they don't give a shit, they just want to sell what they can, make some profit, and do it in the most lazy, sleazy way possible, and not worry about the fact they might be able to make even more profit if they offered quality, because then they risk spending money they might not getting back on quality control and improving. You know, here's the thing about that makes me think that they are just sleazy, cynical, and lazy is after their partnership with Sega went down the toilet, they tried to they came out with some new products that they had in mind, and they actually sounded pretty cool. Some of them were just little tiny devices, not much bigger than a USB thumb drive, that you plug the motherfucker right into your I almost said computer, right into your TV's HDMI port, and then you power it off of USB power. So you have to plug it into something that can put out USB power as well too, which some televisions have. And if your television doesn't, you can get devices that do that. And I think most of them came with a controller. I think they were, I forget if it connected Bluetooth wireless, some sort of wireless controller, I think it was. And the controller looked like a pretty good design based around the Sega Genesis controller, which is a good controller to base your stuff around. And like the physical, there was like a larger version of it that was based around some of their previous mini Sega Genesis designs. Like you could tell that they're recycling the design, but it was a decent looking shape for a mini console anyway. Looked like they were gonna, they were going their separate way from Sega, which was better for Sega than for them, but they were gonna hit the ground running, coming out with great new products. And I guess they tried to contact some people about getting review copies out there, and I'm not sure what all they wanted to do to promote it, but I guess some people ended up refusing the review copy for some reason or other. I forget the details on that. But I do know that, what is his name now? I watched his videos a bunch of times. I can't, his name's not loading in my brain. John Riggs? Anyway, damn it, I can't remember his name. John Riggs, is that his name? I feel as though I'm saying it wrong when I say that for some reason. Anyway, is that a different? I don't know why. I just keep thinking I'm getting the name wrong, but John Riggs comes to mind. And I know I must have screwed the name up, but anyway, a review copy did get out there. Somebody reviewed it, and as far as anybody knows, as far as I can tell, he's a really honest individual who reviews video games. In fact, I think most people speak of him incredibly positively. John Riggs, I'm pretty sure that's a name. I know I'm screwing up a name. It just feels like I'm screwing up the name. But then again, I'm so bad at remembering names. Maybe I just think I'm not remembering the name. Rigged Gaming. I think he said, yeah. I don't know. But anyway, he got a review copy of it. He reviewed it. He was positive about it. He liked it. It had a bunch of old arcade games on it that played pretty much like the arcade games. Now, it was just a review copy, so there might have been some flaws in it, and he might not have noticed all the possible flaws, because it could have been just a glitch that did this or that here and there. But apparently this review copy ended up not really being representative of what was actually produced. Because the copy that ended up in stores that most people bought and saw was not the same thing this guy reviewed. And it was not his fault, because he reviewed the item they gave him, thinking what was going to go out to the public would have been the same item. But apparently, it's really common for like Nintendo on a chip devices to be out there. So I guess this might have been an easy stunt for them to pull. But something about the version that he got with the arcade games on it, they said it was flawed, that wasn't ready, so they released a different version instead. Different version than what they put out to be reviewed. And the version they put out was basically like a Nintendo on a chip, or it had a bunch of old Nintendo ROMs on it. And it played the old Nintendo versions of these arcade games. And as good as the Nintendo Entertainment System was in its time, this was not the arcade games. Not only did it not play the games as well as the arcade machines did, but it wasn't playing the Nintendo games as well as the Nintendo Entertainment System would have. And it wasn't what was previewed by the person that actually got a review copy of it. And it also wasn't, the arcade versions of the games were what they showed on the art on the package. So even the package art was misrepresenting the fact that this had Nintendo games, Nintendo Entertainment System version of games on it, instead of the actual arcade games. So the review copy and the cover art on this thing was advertising that it had arcade games, arcade accurate video screens, and so forth, you know. And the review copy that went out to an actual reviewer had the arcade games on it, which played fairly well. But the damn thing, when it was actually in stores and people bought it, it was just a cheap ass Nintendo on a chip with, you know, the Nintendo version of the arcade games. Or at least that's mostly what people got from it because of the games that were on it. And rather than come clean about it and say they screwed up, because it's obviously screwed up, they just thought nobody would care, which is not a good representation of the video game public, because most people do care about being ripped off in that way. They just figured it'll be good enough, people would buy it and make it look as good as possible. Then when they get home, it'll be just good enough that they'll shut up and accept it. You know, that was their attitude. But people are like, no, this isn't what you put out there to be reviewed. This isn't what's on the box art. You know, this is dishonest. This is bullshit. This is improper. This is bad business. And apparently in response to people asking questions and getting angry about it, they started argue. I don't know that much about the arguing on Twitter, but apparently they even blocked people on Twitter. People who were asking them questions about this, they were like, which is kind of a new thing. For example, let's just say Sony comes up with a really bad idea on what to do with the Ghostbusters franchise. Some idea that sounds like a really corporate decision, you know. Rather than give the people more of what they actually wanted, which was a continuation of Ghostbusters, we'll reboot the thing. That's cheaper and easier and lazier than letting the actual creative force behind it continue along. You know, we'll find a way to market it to a new audience and bullshit like that, you know. Sony made the very corporate decision of screwing with Ghostbusters and making an incredibly horrible bad movie. Now, as luck for Sony had it, you can call any of this luck, they picked people behind the scenes that wanted to work with an all-female Ghostbusters team, which doesn't affect whether or not it's a good movie. It just means that the gender of the new Ghostbusters are going to happen to be female. That doesn't change whether or not the movie was a good idea, whether it was a good movie or a bad movie. It doesn't change a damn thing. And as soon as people complain about it, they start attacking people for being misogynistic. In fact, James Rolfe, who's famously known for being the angry video game nerd, did a serious video, which actually is one of my favorite videos he ever did, even though I don't watch a lot of his stuff, mainly because I'm not really a fan of the angry video game nerd character, though I actually liked a lot of James Rolfe's stuff he does when he just talks as himself. It's just that character isn't my kind of thing. He did a really great video talking about why Ghostbusters 3 doesn't interest him. And he was immediately attacked for being misogynist. And he seemed to have absolutely no problem with whatever gender the characters might be. He talked about things about the fact the movie doesn't look good, the fact that it's not Ghostbusters 3, so other than having the Ghostbusters name, it's not a continuation of the Ghostbusters that he wanted. He talked about all this sort of stuff. It's like, you know, this is not a Ghostbusters movie for me, so I have no intention of running out and reviewing it because they're not making a movie for me. Why should I go and see it? Pretty fair, reasonable thing to say. And he got attacked for being misogynist. People tried to claim he was being misogynistic because he didn't want to see Ghostbusters 2016. And I'm sure he had a laugh when he finally saw the movie. I'm sure at some point he actually saw it. You know, at some point, you can't not go and check out a train wreck like that. So, you know, it's like, how bad was it actually? Pretty fucking bad. Had nothing to do with the gender of the characters, but it was a bad movie. But Sony and a lot of the people involved with the movie continuously attack people as claiming they're just being misogynistic for not liking the movie. Oddly enough, they try not to insult the female fans who didn't like the movie, because that's not as easy to work with their narrative. But there's this new, almost like culture, where a company can now insult or attack the fans for disapproving of what they're doing. For example, if you don't like something new in science fiction or fantasy, they'll call you an entitled nerd and say, well, this isn't for you. This isn't for fans of insert title here. You know, it's not for it's not for you. You expecting this to be for you just because you were a fan of insert title here. You know, why should we cater to you? It's not like we're trying to get the attention of fans of insert title here by making more of insert title here. You know, we're doing it for the new fans who don't actually exist, but we're just covering our ass because we want to make crap, because we think if we use insert title here's name, then it'll make people who used to like watching insert title here come out and pay money for it. But then when you don't like it, well, you're just an entitled nerd. And yes, I used insert title here a whole bunch of times because could be Star Trek Discovery, could be Star Trek 2009, could be Star Wars, could be Ghostbusters, could be anything that turned out shitty that is a part of a large franchise that has existed for a while, that somebody was like, well, if we make more movies or whatever with this name, under this name, all the people that bought the previous stuff, well, they'll just come out and buy more. But if they don't like it, we'll just say it's not for them, and they're just entitled nerds. And it's like, there's this new culture of insulting the fans. It's like, granted, these media franchises, it costs large amounts of money to do what they're doing because of how bloated Hollywood and the entire industry is. Lots of money gets burnt on such things. Fine, fair enough. But when you attack the fans for not liking your product, you're supposed to be using all that money to make something that people like and are willing to pay for. You're not supposed to give the middle finger to the people that didn't like it. You know, you're supposed to earn viewership. You know, if Ghostbusters 2016 sucks and you start insulting Ghostbusters fans for it not being a Ghostbusters movie they would want to see, then you don't know how marketing's supposed to work. But that said, there's such a culture around this sort of thing that a lot of times it's just given a free pass and people just keep going on amongst their business. It's like, oh, well, they insulted all of us fans who didn't like insert title here. You know, oh, well, the next insert other title here movie will be out, you know, in a couple months. It looks like it's going to suck. Oh, well, when we hate it, they'll just call us entitled nerds again, you know. Yeah. Now, oddly enough, if a sports team playing their games of sports ball lose too many times, they'll start to criticize the coach of that team. You know, it's not like the other team could have been better, you know. I mean, somebody's got to win, but, you know, a certain team playing some sort of sports ball is in the news for having lost too many times. You'll see people, they're going to fire that coach. They're going to do better because we, the fans, are angry because our team didn't win enough. Yeah. Which is a game of sports ball of some sort, you know, where one group of people versus another group of people, the outcome can often be luck, or maybe just the other teams they were going up against happen to be more skilled, you know, whatever. But there'll be like heavy criticism of a coach, of a game of whatever sort of sports ball it might be, you know, for having a losing streak. And while I don't care much about sports, I find it interesting that there could be so much heat over a team losing being a game that can be won or lost by a bunch of people running around on some sort of field playing some sort of fucking game of some sort of fucking sports ball, you know. You know, and then you'll hear stuff on the news where people are like talking about it. Well, they really got to get rid of that coach. Interesting. Well, I would say that it's a little more controlled whether or not you make a good movie, something that entertains the fans and the masses in general. a little bit more of a controlled situation because you're not actually sending a bunch of people to run out on a field in a random chaotic situation where other people are running out on a field, both being guided towards winning by other sides. It's not that simple. You're just trying to win over the fans. So, no, you don't often see a major cultural movement towards insulting fans of sport ball for getting upset when their team loses. Well, there's a difference when a movie sucks. When a movie franchise or television franchise or an entertainment franchise goes down the toilet. And that's deliberate. That's quality control. That's people writing, directing, and basically producing something that sucks in the eyes of its target audience. To insult that target audience for not liking something is absurd. So while I use the example of sports ball where the coach takes all the heat, it's like somehow the media entertainment industry has managed to take the heat off directors and producers and writers who make really stupid, really shitty movies. Now, granted, a lot of bad movies got free passes and made lots of money. Look at what they did to the Transformers live-action movies. Those were pretty bad and made a lot of money. So to a certain degree or other, you can kind of accept that Hollywood, which is, business, most of those big movie companies, whatever, they're big businesses, you can kind of accept that they're going to look at that situation and be like, you know what? Doesn't matter if it's really good or bad. Find some really absurd, ridiculous action that makes an impact and just fucking do it. Just fucking do it. And dumb movies get made because people were willing to pay to experience dumb movies so that they get to see, Optimus Prime and Bumblebee on the movie screen again. Or maybe it'll be the Ninja Turtles or the Ghostbusters or whatever. But it came to a point where it's like people get sick of that sort of thing, and now some of those movies are not making quite as much money as they used to because that's what happens when you produce shit for too long. People get fed up with being sold a pretty package, opening up, and what's inside? Just a fucking turd. Just a fucking pile of shit, And, that's... They're just, at best, they're frosting a turd. Putting frosting on a turd and telling you to eat it. And it's like, if you realize it's a turd, you're not going to want to take a bite of it. They're only going to trick people for so long. They're only going to sell so many Transformers movies that really, really suck. As bad as they sucked. And as for Ghostbusters, you could kind of tell that was a turd under the frosting for quite a, right from the start. They didn't do a good job of frosting over the turd with that one. People knew that was going to suck right from the start. Which, if it seems like I got off topic, that's the thing about AtGames. They kept frosting a turd. They kept selling a great concept. The frosting was the Sega Genesis name, but the turd was how badly it was emulated. And at first, you could kind of accept the flaws a long time ago, because Sega Genesis emulation is hard. But as they came out with new models, and they kept screwing up the sound over and over again, and the first time there was any improvement was the HD console, and even that was horribly flawed. It's like, no. They're just using Sega as frosting on their turd. The old expression, the frosted turd. Which is not a very savory metaphor. But it's not a very savory situation, so it works. The thing with, I suppose, getting back to Ghostbusters 2016, when they frosted that turd, they frosted that turd with urine and vomit. So it's kind of like they tried to cover it up with something pretty gross. Ew. That would be the perfect statement of what Ghostbusters 2016 was. It was a frosted turd, but that frosting was mostly vomit and urine. And that's the thing, is AtGames. That's what AtGames is doing. And the thing is, when they get called out for the turd, rather than trying to win over the people they disappointed, rather than apologizing, rather than even just trying to ignore the situation. They start blocking people on Twitter, which is no, it's just it's just causing more trouble. When companies get antagonistic to the people that they're supposed to be trying to serve, trying to sell stuff to those people, and then they just insult those people, they're working against their own interest in the long run. Though that said, people have become pretty complacent in that situation. I mean, as much as people criticize Sony for what they did with Ghostbusters and are criticizing Act Games now for it, and the heat that Atari took, for the most part, it's just business as usual, and people are like, well, I'll just wait for the next movie or video game or whatever, And a perfect example of that, of what Act Games is doing, is Atari did something similar. They came out with this idea called the Atari Box. Now they're calling it the Atari Video Computer System. Gee, I think that name was already used, wasn't it? Was it something made before the Atari 2600 that happened to exactly be the Atari 2600 before they used that as its name? Yeah, I do believe. They already made an Atari Video Computer System. Because that was exactly the name of the early models of the Atari 2600. The earliest models of the Atari 2600 didn't have 2600 on it as a name. I think there was like a serial code on it somewhere that said 2600, but it was just straight up labeled the Atari Video Computer System. And then they're calling this device the Atari Video Computer System. Well, whatever. Atari Box at least made it stand out. They could have called it the Atari A-Box, because you have the Xbox. Why not the A-Box? Yeah, the S-Box. The Atari A-Box. Atari Box. Well, anyway, when one of the guys at Atari was in an interview. And he didn't come off as though he knew what he was talking about. And the interviewer, when he reported on what was, determined, he didn't really go out of his way too far to insult the person he was interviewing. But he pointed out, I forget exactly how it was, but it basically came off as though the person he was talking to didn't know what he was talking about, just didn't have the information. And as a result, Atari started to criticize this journalist as misrepresenting them and just trying to sensationalize the whole thing. And he's like, well, technically you let me record the whole thing, so here, I'll just release the whole thing. So the person released the audio from the interview, the whole thing, and it's like, yeah, the guy didn't know what he was talking about. The journalist was telling the truth about this guy from Atari not knowing what he was talking about. But Atari was like insulting people, putting them down. I mean, even if the journalist had misrepresented something, the way they attacked him came off as cheap and cheesy on their part. They didn't really show a lot of class. They didn't rebuttal what he said in a good way. They just kind of attacked him. And then it was proven that he was telling the truth. So Atari was basically slandering him, but they were doing it to attack back at their critics. And Atari has been taking that attitude towards critics who are cynical of the Atari box. Well, now the Atari Video Computer System, but I might as well just keep calling it the Atari box because there's already an Atari Video Computer System out there. So critics of the Atari box, got heavily slandered, put down, mocked, insulted, whatever. I forget exactly how a lot of it went down, but basically they were put down by Atari. Now, granted, some people could look at this as, well, this is just Atari fighting back in a little squabbling war on the internet. It's like, no, Atari's trying to promote the product. People who review and discuss such products on the internet have been cynical. And in fact, for the most part, I believe, politely cynical. They might say, what are you doing? This seems like a bad idea. I don't think this is going to, turn out to be a good product. Like, sometimes you'll get that. But for all intents and purposes, if Atari wants to look like they're producing something good, they shouldn't just say, well, you're just an idiot for being cynical of this product that happens to be similar to other products which have failed. That's the wrong way to do things. Which was what Atari did, which further makes their Atari box look like a load of crap. And it makes the whole Atari company look like a load of crap. Which, personally, I don't really want to hate on Atari. They had some pretty great history in the video game industry. Though what once was Atari and is Atari now are two very different things. There is kind of like a history of... Oh, is that a message? Oh, somebody followed me on Instagram. Cool! Yay! Instagram. No, but Atari... Atari, not doing good there. And it seems as though AtGames is going that route. AtGames, they lost Sega as a partner, which having access to Sega's intellectual property is probably the best possible frosting they could ever have to cover their turd of a product that they were trying to sell off. Now, they could have done great things with arcade games and Nintendo games and stuff like that they got the license to, like if they, some of the other stuff that they were producing. And my sinuses are starting to seal shut. My nose is a little itchy, and so I'm just going to, little shot of nasal spray here. And if that gets to the back of my sinuses, that should clear. The sinuses should open up a bit. Anyway, if, they might have, because Sega Genesis is a little bit harder than your average console to emulate. Nowadays, it should be able to pull it off, I mean, your cell phone can do a better job of Sega Genesis emulation than the AtGames consoles. And here they were working with Sega for, well, I know it was back in the 20s at least, they had a pretty good history, timeline-wise, history of time working with Sega. They should have been able to work out a fair bit more bugs than they did. But nope. So when they lost Sega as a partner, they lost some pretty good intellectual property there. They lost an amazing frosting they could have used to cover their turd because they weren't willing to fix up their turd. They were way too slow to even tweak it. When they finally tweaked it was the HD turd, and too little, too late. So they lost Sega. Now, when they come out with this new console, which seems like, they're picking up where they left off. They're just not doing it with Sega. When they announced this thing, and it's like false advertising right from the start. The models that were given out to people that reviewed it, not good. Not what was actually in the stores. The version in the stores not even being what's shown on the box. Like the box showing arcade versions, while what's actually on the system is actually old Nintendo ROMs, game ROMs. That's false advertising. That's cheesy. It's sleazy. It's lame, and they don't give a shit, because they figured they'd get away with it, or at least it would cause so little fuss that it wouldn't have made a difference. Except now it has, and they're getting their asses handed to them for mistreating their audience. They're getting a lot of heat right now, and they deserve it. They deserve it. Like I started off saying when I started talking about what AtGames did, it's the exact opposite of how Intellivision is coming off. Intellivision is coming off as though the people behind the Intellivision Amico, whether or not it looks like something you're going to like or not, it looks like they're doing this because they love video games. They love the name Intellivision, their history with video games. And they're basically coming back and trying to make something that will appeal to like some of the people that don't normally buy a video game console, that otherwise might just be a cell phone game player. While AtGames, At Games had Sega as a partner. They had access to the intellectual property of Sega for their consoles. They also had Atari and they had Coleco and Intellivision. But of all the people, Sega was Sonic the Hedgehog and Phantasy Star and Golden Axe and all that wonderful stuff. Echo the fucking Dolphin. Echo the Dolphin. You know? Shining Force. And did I say Phantasy Star? Yes, I did say Phantasy Star, but not enough times. You can't say Phantasy Star enough. With Sega comes Phantasy Star. Phantasy motherfucking Star. You know? Sonic the Hedgehog and Phantasy Star. I mean, Vector Man. The first Vector Man was great. Second Vector Man, not so much. But first Vector Man was one of the greatest classics of the 16-bit era. They had access to all of it. Well, maybe not all of it, but they had access to it through Sega. And it was the best frosting they ever could have put on their turd. And over the years, they just didn't improve the turd. And they lost Sega. And now they're trying to go it without Sega. And it looked like they could have pulled it off. But they screwed it up. They screwed it up because they didn't care what they were selling you. They didn't care how they represented it. And now they're failing for it. Exact opposite of the Intellivision Amico. From everything, if you look at like that interview with Tommy Tallarico that Re-Res did, I think the channel they did it on was Re-Res too. When I actually looked into like who's behind the Intellivision Amico, it's like, you know what? Win, lose, or draw, when this thing comes out, I actually think it's made by people that care about what they produce. I actually believe that. Now, it could be a mistake, but that sort of thing happens every now and then where something is produced by people who actually care about their product. And whether or not that means it'll succeed or not, sometimes, not always, you know. But it's a positive thing. It makes me think, you know what? I really hope this is the weird little oddball video game console that could and does, you know? I'm kind of rooted for the Intellivision Amico the more that I read about, you know, the people behind it and the ideas they have. Well, At Games, I kind of want to like them. I love their little portable Atari flashback device. And if they could have fixed up the fucking sound, the Sega Genesis flashback portable would have been like the best device you could have ever stuck in your pocket. So much even better than what your favorite cell phone, better than Nintendo DS. It would have been so perfect that I know there's other screens out there that look really good, but it had like this perfect little screen, perfect little buttons and D-pad. It was just so fucking perfect. And then it played like the Sega Genesis games, and they looked so good on that screen. And then the sound comes out of it, and the audio is pure sonic shit. Pure wavelengths, fecal waves in the air, just auditory diarrhea. If they could have tuned that up, you know, fixed the sound chip, fixed something about it to make the sound better, what a sweet little fucking device that thing would have been. And the Atari flashback, the Atari version, that thing's great. That thing's awesome. Just so wonderfully lovable. The Atari flashback portable. They're not. They have like some good stuff, and they're so close to being great, but they just don't care about the customer. Now, I became cynical of a different company, Retrobit. I loved a lot of the stuff Retrobit makes. In fact, I still do. But Retrobit, they came out with the Super Retro Trio. I watched reviews on it. I thought this thing was awesome. It came with a controller that was Super Nintendo style, but you could plug it into a Sega Genesis. And then there was a switch so that you could either play like the video game systems it played, which was Nintendo Entertainment System, Sega Genesis, and Super Nintendo, you could play all three game systems if you flick the switch to the right position from the Sega Genesis control port. So you had a Super Nintendo style controller that you could plug into a Genesis control port and play Sega Genesis games on a Sega Genesis with that controller, or Atari 2600 games with that controller, which was Super Nintendo style. Or you could plug a Sega Genesis into the Super Retro Trio and play all those game systems from a Sega Genesis controller, which is absolutely a perfect way to play those games, especially the Nintendo Entertainment System games. Best of both worlds, because the Sega Genesis with its superior D-pad and a better overall button layout, but the Super Nintendo with its kind of specialized button layout, which is perfect for different things. You know, you could play all the games on this console with basically either controller, because it came with a Super Nintendo style Genesis controller, and also you could flick the switch to a different position where you play Genesis games with the Genesis controller, Nintendo games with a Nintendo Entertainment System controller, and Super Nintendo games with a Super Nintendo controller. It was like this perfect mix of possibilities, and it played Nintendo Entertainment System games excellently. Sega Genesis games, excellent. Even got the sound right. That's so rare. Not completely rare, but just so often a little flaw in the Genesis audio, and this thing got it right. You know, if you could fit a power-based converter on it, and there are certain ways you can pull that off, you can even play Sega Master System games. So the Master System games do tend to be a tiny bit glitchy on the thing, but still, for the most part, it got Genesis right. And it also played Super Nintendo games right. With Super Nintendo, I noticed the colors look just a tiny bit whiter than they should, but pretty damn close. This device was probably the best device in retro gaming. I'm just looking now. No. This is the wind. It's kind of a windy day. Thought I might have heard a car come in. But no. All right. Anyway, the device was what I thought at the time to be the best device in retro video gaming, but I don't recommend one. If you can get it used and you know exactly what model you're getting, if you can get the model I described right there, I recommend it. I went and I bought one new. I was considering buying more than one of it if it had been, what I saw reviewed online. But they up and changed it. Now, the little pictures on the box represented the earlier model, but I bought one, ordered it off the internet because it wasn't like wasn't that easy to find in stores. Ordered one, so happy to get it. First thing I noticed is it came with a Super Nintendo style controller that plugged into a Super Nintendo port. Not the weird mix of mixing Genesis and Super Nintendo stuff. And the switch it so that you control all three game systems from the Super Nintendo controller port, which kind of ruined my plans of playing Super Nintendo games with a Genesis controller, which was one of the main reasons I wanted this device for. Okay, then on top of that, you can buy Super Nintendo controllers that are kind of Genesis style, a little bit, programmable controllers and stuff like that have the 6-button layout and a better D-pad than what Nintendo usually offers. You can get that stuff anyway, so I suppose not that big of a deal. And it seemed to do Nintendo Entertainment System games all right. Sega Genesis games, it screwed up the audio on them. It no longer got Sega Genesis audio correct on this device. And Super Nintendo audio was even screwed up. Normally they get Super Nintendo audio right. Didn't even get the Super Nintendo audio right. So it did Nintendo Entertainment System okay. Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo did not play acceptably. And then the controller that came with it. It was a Super Nintendo style controller. Kind of like you'd get with the Super Retro Duo. The Super Retro Duo was a pretty cool little device. Not perfect on the Nintendo Entertainment System side of things, but it did Super Nintendo all right, And, so you'd think it would be another game system that came with a Super Nintendo compatible controller. You'd think you could just plug this controller with the Super Nintendo style port into the Super Nintendo system. And you can plug it in. It just won't work with the games. But I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh, well, It won't play Super Nintendo games on a Super Nintendo, but surely it would play Super Nintendo games on the Super Retro Trio. Nope. On this game system, the controller that came with it, which was a Super Nintendo controller with a plug that would allow it to plug into a Super Nintendo, and you can plug it into the Super Nintendo controller port on the device. It'll play Sega Genesis games with the wrong shaped controller for playing Sega Genesis games. It'll play Nintendo Entertainment System games, which will play just fine with a Super Nintendo controller or a Genesis controller. Both are like superior to the Nintendo Entertainment System controller. The Nintendo Entertainment System controller is iconic and definitely good enough for Nintendo games, but this is still a good option for Nintendo Entertainment System games. Then when you go to play Super Nintendo games with this Super Nintendo style controller that appears to be a knockoff, their own special manufacture of a Super Nintendo controller, when you try to use that controller with Super Nintendo games, not just on the Super Nintendo console itself, but on this console that this controller came with, it will not work with Super Nintendo games. You can use it to play Sega Genesis games, even though it's not the best shape for playing Sega Genesis games. You can use it for playing Nintendo Entertainment System games, but it doesn't work right with Super Nintendo games. So it basically comes with a Super Nintendo controller that will not work with Super Nintendo games. Not just not working with Super Nintendo games on a Super Nintendo, but it will not work with Super Nintendo games on the system it came with. That's a pretty shitty combination. So basically you'd have to plug your own Super Nintendo controller into this device to play Super Nintendo devices, or to play Super Nintendo games on this device. So you'll need an additional Super Nintendo controller to play Super Nintendo games on this device. So, I already had Super Nintendo controllers, so whatever, but it was a convoluted load of shit. And I did buy another one, but the only one I ever bought after that was a used one. And I love it. I got the used version, has the switch that you can switch to play all games through the Sega Genesis control port. Came with basically what is a Sega Genesis controller, but styled and shaped like Super Nintendo, which is an interesting novelty. Loved it. Loved everything about it. Loved plugging a Sega Genesis controller into it and finally playing Illusion of Gaia with a Sega Genesis controller. Just loved it. Just loved it. The controller that came with it, plugged it into Atari 2600 and was playing Defender with a Super Nintendo style controller. Lovely novelty, The used version of this console I got, wonderful. I absolutely love that version of the Super Retro Trio. But the version they were selling after that, the version that they were selling when I tried to buy it new, it was a piece of garbage. And it didn't do what... The thing that I really wanted was the ability to play Super Nintendo games with a Sega Genesis controller. And secondary to that was to have a Super Nintendo style